Hello and welcome. Today we take a look at another one of the many places that's on my must-see list. Join me for a look at the infamous Alcatraz Island, aka The Rock. This little island had so much packed into it throughout time. The island is located about 1.5 miles off the San Francisco coast, and it is about 1,670 feet long by about 590 feet wide, covering an area of about 22 acres. While it is believed that explorers likely saw the island before its actual discovery, it didn't get discovered and enter history until 1775. In August of 1775, Lieutenant Don Juan Manuel de Ayala set out to discover the set of 3 islands, today known as Alcatraz, Angel, and Yerba Buena Islands. He named Angel Island Isla de Los Angeles and continued on and reached Alcatraz Island. He named it La Isla de los Altraces, meaning Island of the Pelicans, due to the many pelicans on the island. Some believe he actually landed on Yerba Buena, and the map was incorrectly labeled. Either way, in 1776, Captain Frederick Beechey of the British Navy, with permission from the Mexican authorities, surveyed the bay and gave each island the name by which it is known today. In June 1846, Mexican Governor Pio Pica gave the island to Julian Workman with the intention of having him build a lighthouse on the island. This was the earliest known private owner of the island. He did not, in fact, build a lighthouse, but instead pretty quickly passed the title of the island to his son-in-law, Francis Temple. Not long after, in 1847, the island was then bought by John C. Fremont, governor of California, and he bought the island for $5,000 in the name of the U.S. government. Turns out, Fremont didn't actually have the juice to make such a purchase and was eventually court-martialed for this and other things. Although the U.S. rejected this purchase, being that Fremont couldn't do such a thing, President Fillmore had an order in 1850 making Alcatraz and other parcels of land the property of the U.S. government, meaning no one else could purchase them in the future. In 1851, the Board of Engineers for the Pacific Coast stated they were under the impression that the U.S. did own this island, among others. So therefore, they kept the island. Plans for what Alcatraz would be used for came into fruition pretty quickly, considering its prime location within the San Francisco Bay for military defense. The plan had 3 general objectives. 1. Prevent the passage of hostile ships through the harbor. 2. In the event that said ships did make it through, they could arrange batteries for defense. And 3. As a line of defense that could fire on 3 passages in San Pablo Bay. Initial proposed fortifications included batteries, a defensive barrack, and a guardhouse. In 1854, the lighthouse was finally erected and was the first on the U.S. West Coast. It was replaced by a taller one in 1909 after an earthquake damaged the first. The lighthouse actually still stands today. Starting in the late 1850s, the first military prisoners began being held on the island. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, 85 cannons were mounted and increased to 106 by 1866. The fort never actually fired any of its cannons, but instead was used to house Confederate sympathizers. The prison also held private citizens accused of treason. Seeing as it served so well as a prison during the Civil War, a brick jailhouse was built in 1867 and was officially designated as a long-term detention facility in 1868. It was a prime location for detainment considering its location. The Spanish-American War in 1898 caused the population of the prison to skyrocket from 26 to over 450 prisoners. In 1907, Alcatraz was designated as the Western U.S. military prison, and then in 1909, the Citadel was torn down and its basement level was used for a foundation of a new military prison. Luckily for them, they had the workforce right there on the island. The new prison was built by the prisoners there between 1909 and 1911. It was renamed the Pacific Branch U.S. Disciplinary Barracks in 1915. It was then deactivated on October 12, 1933, and transferred to the Bureau of Prisons. The transition is said to have actually went smoothly. One of the conditions of the transfer is that the penitentiary was required to remain responsible for laundry services for military posts and transports in the Bay Area. The director of the Bureau of Prisons, Sanford Bates, recognized the need for some improvements and fortifications to get it up to the level required for maximum security. They did make some changes, and although there were still some issues when it came time to open, the first batch of new prisoners arrived on August 11th, 1934. Alcatraz was made for those prisoners who just kept wreaking havoc at other federal prisons and needed the highest of high securities. What better place than an escape-proof prison on an isolated island? Over the next 29 years that it served as a prison, no successful escapes were ever made. There were a total of 36 prisoners who attempted escape 14 times. Of these, 23 were caught alive, 6 were shot and killed, 2 drowned, and 5 are listed as missing and presumed drowned. The most violent of the attempts was on May 2nd, 1946, and led to the Battle of Alcatraz. During this, 2 guards were killed and 14 were wounded, as well as 3 of the 6 being killed and 1 non-participating inmate being wounded. 2 of the other escapees were later executed for this. The most famous of all the escapes was June 11th, 1962. This is the one that made it into a movie in 1979 called Escape from Alcatraz. The reason it was made into a movie and is remembered by many is because of the clever way they went about it. The 3 men, John and Clarence Anglin and Frank Morris, used dummy heads made of plaster, paint, and real human hair to fool the guards. There was initially a 4th involved named Alan West, but he ultimately didn't make it out. In addition to the dummy heads, they stole over 50 raincoats to fashion into water rafts for their escape. The most labor-intensive part of the escape was the digging, in which they used handmade tools. While the plan was formed December of 1961, the digging wouldn't actually be complete until June of 1962. So on June 11th, 1962, the men went to make their escape. Alan West wasn't able to get the grill off and therefore was unable to make the escape. The men climbed to the cell house roof, made their way 100 feet across it, and then made their way down 50 feet of piping. Alan West did finally make his way through the grill, but by the time he did, the other 3 were gone and were never seen again. He later revealed in an interview that the plan was to use the rafts to make it to shore, steal a car, rob a store for clothing, and then to go their separate ways. These are 3 of the 5 men listed as missing but presumed drowned. There was no evidence found that they ever made it to shore, but also no conclusive evidence that they drowned either. Many speculate that at least 1, if not all 3, made a successful escape and then they went on to live their lives. The FBI eventually concluded they drowned because there were no such crimes reported of stolen cars or clothing. They also believed the water, which was between 50 and 54 degrees, would make it impossible for the waters to be swam. Some personal effects and a life jacket were also said to be found in the water. I guess we'll never fully know what happened, but speculation for this I'm sure will continue on. So what are some facts on the prison and its inmates? To start, there were 4 cell blocks, A, B, C, and D. A was rarely used and was mostly for short-term periods. B and C were the more normal cells, and there were 336 of them. B was actually nicknamed Broadway by the inmates. Each cell on these blocks was 5 feet by 9 feet. All of these contained a small sink, a sleeping cot, and a toilet. D block was used for segregation, and prisoners here were confined to their cells for 24 hours a day. There were 36 segregation cells and 6 solitary confinement cells on this block. Aside from the positive of getting their own cells, unlike at other prisons, it also had the best menu in the federal prison system. Inmates had tasty food and could get as much or as little as they wanted, provided they finished their food and didn't leave any on the tray. Otherwise, they could lose their food privileges for the next meal. Over time, there were about 1,545 total inmates over the years, with the highest number at a time being 302, and the lowest being 222. During this time, not as many as you would think died here. 8 were murdered by other prisoners, 5 committed suicide, and 15 died from natural illnesses. The average stay here was about 8 years until they would be sent back to other prisons. Aside from those who became famous for their escape attempts, there were also several other famous prisoners throughout the years. These included Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, Robert Stroud, aka the Birdman of Alcatraz, Roy Gardner, Henry Young, Alvin Karpis, James Whitey Bulger, and Mickey Cohen. Let's touch on a few of these. Capone and Machine Gun Kelly were both notorious gangsters. Capone spent 4.5 years on Alcatraz, and Kelly spent about 17 years here. Robert Stroud was a murderer and proved unruly while incarcerated elsewhere. He assaulted an orderly and stabbed another inmate, which got him transferred to Leavenworth. He then stabbed a guard and spent the next 30 years of his new sentence breeding birds and maintaining a lab, gaining him the nickname Birdman. After the guards found out the lab equipment was actually being used for brewing, he was then sent to Alcatraz for the next 17 years. Gardner was a notorious robber and gangster. He landed on Alcatraz after he ended up escaping from the federal penitentiary on McNeil Island. After being on the most wanted list and eventually getting recaptured and charged, he was then sent to Leavenworth. After that, he was sent to Atlanta Federal Prison. Here, he attempted to escape, and then he led a prison break. He was eventually transferred back to Leavenworth and finally made his way to Alcatraz in 1934. While it's rumored he thought about attempting an escape, he never actually did so and was released on June 17, 1938. The others all have similar tales which landed them on the rock to serve their time. Alcatraz was a prison until 1963 when it finally closed. Not only was the cost exorbitant compared to other prisons, but the 3 missing and presumed drowned escapees in the previous year, 1962, didn't bode well for the prison's reputation. The action on the island didn't stop there. As part of a protest on March 8, 1964, Native American activists occupied the island for the first time. It was again occupied beginning November 20th, 1969, when the United Indians of all tribes were protesting the policies relating to Native Americans. These people remained for 19 months and 2 days before ending on June 11, 1971. It finally ended after President Nixon established a policy of self-determination. Alcatraz then became part of the Golden Gate National Recreation Area in 1972 and was then listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1976 and became a National Historic Landmark in 1986. The National Park Service began renovations in 2011, and today the park attracts 1.7 million visitors yearly. One of the yearly traditions is people will try and swim from Alcatraz to the bay just like the escaped convicts would have done in 1962. While many buildings have suffered from the harsh conditions on the island, there is still plenty to see here. From military fortification to military prison to federal prison to attraction, Alcatraz saw many things over its many years of operation. Hopefully one day I'll get to visit once it opens back up again. Well, that's all we have for today. I'm sure I could have gone on and on about the stories of the different inmates housed here, but I suggest just looking up a few, especially if you're familiar with their names, because their stories are very interesting. Thanks for sticking around for this long, and I'll catch you next time.